The liturgy, as I said, is the heart of it, but other music enters in, other music plays a vital part. A constant effort to bring the eternal in line with the contemporary, or rather to join the contemporary to a knowledge of the eternal. Besides the art, there are a variety of other preoccupations that are helpful in this regard. Work may take many forms, but there are a few crafts that have the skill, the precision, and indeed the reward that attaches to this refined art of printing. Here, Brother Antoninus, who is a nationally known poet and a very famous fine printer, is printing some copies of his own poems on his hand press, a very simple and fundamental type of printing instrument. You will see that this is not a mass production effort, but the job here is to produce a piece of printing so fine, so precise, so well turned out that it serves to represent and magnify the nature of the work that's been presented, the long poetic line and the beauty of its presence on the printed page, to give the effect that the poet intended in writing. Life in a monastery is in many ways like a city. A city will have its maintenance and its creative departments. The carpentry shop, which you saw a few moments ago, was used for making the furniture in this little chapel. You see, the various subgroups within the monastery have their own life, in some ways apart from the group, and in some ways identified with the total general monastic life. This is a chapel which was designed for the cooperator brothers, brothers who really do most of the actual running of the monastery itself, and who are not preparing for the priesthood, but whose work is to help the fathers, both at the time of their preparation in St. Albert's and their work later on in the various Dominican installations. This very light and bright chapel is for the use of the student brothers, the largest part of the community. These are the men who are being trained for ordination to the priesthood, and this chapel is in their own section of the building. A very beautiful prayer that's recited during Lent asks that we would not be cast off in our old age by the Lord, but when our strength shall have failed, he shall not depart from us. And the religious life holds fast to this principle, that faithfulness, companionship, support of one another should be present not only in youth and in learning, but also in our declining years. A wonderful thing about monastic life is that the teacher and the student are both equally members of the same order. The professor has been through these studies himself not too many years before, understands the problem of the student, and the student in turn may very easily in a few years be himself responsible for the training of other young men coming up to continue the 750-year-old tradition of Dominican learning. Around St. Albert's in Oakland, there are a number of very fine new residential developments. And the problem with the church in this type of area is that more people come in than can be adequately cared for. So a large monastery is helpful in that it provides priests to go out and assist by saying Sunday Mass, by hearing confessions, and generally contributing to the sacramental life of the parishes. This, of course, is a privilege and a pleasure for the fathers at St. Albert's to be able to support the church in this way. The idea that I mentioned of a city requires, of course, that we be able to take care of ourselves. The monastery as a little city is almost self-dependent. The gardens, which are always impressive and beautiful, are cared for by the fathers and the brothers themselves. But there is one element of the life at St. Albert's that requires a helping hand, and those are the areas of the domestic care of the kitchen and of the laundry. And for this we are indebted to the support and help of the Dominican sisters of the congregation of Oakford. The mother house of this Dominican sisters congregation is in South Africa, but most of the sisters themselves come to us from Germany. They have a separate and entirely detached convent building at St. Albert's where they live their own life. The food prepared here in the kitchen is served in the monastic refectory by the brothers. We will shortly have some observations on how dinner is served in a monastery. It's a little different than what we would be accustomed to under other circumstances. It's not too surprising, really, that in the religious life, everything takes on a certain formality. But at first, you tend to attach more importance to things than they really deserve. This looks like a very important event. Actually, it is just the community on its way to dinner. The pathway where they are walking is the cloister walk. It's open on one side, and there's a garden out there. Now, this cloister walk extends all the way around the inside of the building with a little square in the middle. Before going into the refectory for the meal, the fathers and brothers pause to say a prayer for the dead. In former times, this cloister walk was also used as a kind of burial place, a kind of mausoleum where the dead members of the community were buried. But of course, this is no longer done. Still, we do pause to pray for the dead before going into the meal. You'll notice now that in the monastic refectory, the fathers and brothers sit all around the side, and the meal is served from the middle. This is not only an austerity measure, but also for convenience in serving. And St. Augustine tells us that when we eat, we must learn to entertain our minds with what we hear, just as our bodies are refreshed by the food that we eat. He tells us, listen quietly and in silence to the book that is read to us. And this becomes a very useful habit because we learn to attend always to the growth in knowledge and learning, and the business of eating becomes a simple and in some respects a rather quick thing. There's a tradition in Dominican life that the meal is served to the youngest first, and the superior is the last person to be served. You noticed in the church that everything was done by standing, sitting, kneeling. Same way here, when we pray after meals, there's bowing, there's standing. Sometimes there are processions in order that the prayer of thanks to God for the sustenance of the body might be offered up by the whole person. An important part of monastic life is the idea of seclusion, of being in the world and still set apart a little ways. Now, this quiet garden that you see is in the middle of a residential block. It is surrounded on all four sides by the buildings of St. Albert's Monastery. But it is quiet in here, and a person can be recollected, capable of devoting himself to his prayer and to his study, so that he will grow in knowledge of eternal things, without at the same time becoming separated from those things that are of our own day. For our brief tour through the various elements of the life at St. Albert's, we left the chapel briefly. Now we return to pick up again the Mass where we left it, at the Sanctus. In these few minutes you have seen that various members of the community have different works to do. Their own personalities are developed and made to grow by encouraging their natural capacities and capabilities. So that for this reason, all Dominicans have a certain individual characteristics that enable them to minister to the needs of a wide variety of people. And at the same time, they are gathered and become as one here in the church. Because, as Christ said, He is the vine, we are the branches. We are many, but He is one, and in Him we are united. And so, as we move in to the central moment of the celebration of the Mass, as we move in towards the consecration, our hearts and our mind become preoccupied again with the concentration on Christ, with the remembrance that the religious life is a following of Christ, an acceptance of His counsels that we should be poor, that we should be chaste, that we should be obedient. The moment of consecration in the solemn high mass is at hand. The solemn mass, according to the rite of the Dominican order, is a little different than one might be familiar with in churches where the Roman rite is observed, but essentially the sacrifice is the same. The Dominican order has this special, very dignified and very beautiful, but still simple rite for saying Mass, because in its earliest years the order was one of the first centralized monastic organizations within the Catholic Church. At that time the manner of saying Mass varied widely from place to place, but the Dominican order served as a unifying force. At midnight on Easter Saturday, the Paschal candle is lit, symbolizing the resurrection of Christ. And a hymn of joy is sung at the dawning of new hope for Christians. Here, Father Kieran Healy sings this beautiful hymn, The Exulted. Rejoice and exult, all creation rejoice, because of the resurrection of Christ. He says, let the angels in heaven rejoice. Let the little bees who made the wax that is used in this candle rejoice. And let all the people gathered in this church rejoice, because Christ is risen for us. We have seen in our tour that life in the monastery is true life. And St. John tells us of Christ that in him was life, and the life was the light of man, and the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness didn't understand it. This was the true light, he says, which came for all men, that they might believe through him. In this business of believing through Christ, he uses his ministers, his servants, his priests, as instruments, and that's what St. Albert's is for, to form the instruments. Father McPhee has produced this movie, assisted here at St. Albert's by Father Parmesano, and also by Father Leo Thomas, who was in charge of the Cooperator Brothers. And I have been privileged to comment for you.